hello everyone and welcome. Thank you so much for being here today. Today we're going to be hearing from the lovely Lisa and Morten Hallgren. They are the co-owners of Ravines Wine Cellars in the Finger Lakes, New York. And we're very excited to have them. So big thank you to them and a big thank you to all of you for being here. So let's dive into it. Lisa and Morten, we wanted to kick it off with just hearing a little bit about Ravines Winery and how you guys got started, and then we'll talk about the wine. So let's get into it. And cheers.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for having us here today. We're here in our barrel room underneath our big tasting barn in Geneva, New York. So Morten and I came to the Finger Lakes about 20-some years ago, 23 years ago, and we came out of the fine wine and food business. I'm a chef and was in the food business, and Morten is an enologist trained in Montpellier, France, and his parents had a winery that we worked on. We worked at Summers through the last 20 years of our college, and before that. Anyway, so we ended up in the Finger Lakes, and we're super excited to be here because it's kind of for a long time was a little bit of an underachieving region. People were making a lot of sweeter wines, and just the kind of winemaking they were doing here. It was I think we talked about it being a little bit just underachieving because we could make such beautiful terroir-driven red wines and white wines here, and it wasn't really so much happening, but we saw the promise and we were like super excited about being in the region. And so the only problem is we didn't have any money, we didn't have any vineyards of our own, we didn't have a winery, and so we were lucky enough that Morten was working at Dr. Frank's, and a lot of the vineyards that he worked with, that they purchased fruit from. Morten had identified a couple of those and thought they were so interesting, so expressive. And so we started purchasing from them. We rented a barn down the street, and Morten was working there full time at Dr. Frank's, and then had our own little project. And then the following year, which was 2002, I think 2003, we opened a tasting room in our house. And we had 3 little kids at the time, and then we just started that way. We could see very early on that our type of dry Riesling and dry wines were not, people weren't used to them in this area. So we got in the car and took them all over New York State, trying to find our people, our retailers, restaurateurs, somms, and we built our reputation that way, looking for people and getting people interested in our wine.
Yeah, the cool climate wine regions are really underrepresented in the United States. I mean, there are some wonderful wines being made out west, but they're from warmer, more Mediterranean climate. So we've always felt that the cool climate wines have been terribly underrepresented. And while the Finger Lakes is not a large region in terms of acreage and production, I think it's important to have this cool climate element in there, because we present a very different style of wine from what people might otherwise be drinking domestically. So that's kind of what I think that the Finger Lakes region brings to the scene, is some alternatives, some very food-friendly wines, a different kind of balance and style. And we set out applying the traditional techniques that we had learned in France, both practicing at my family's winery in Côte de Provence, and also what I learned at the winemaking school in Montpellier, and applying that to a new, exciting region.
Wow, that is so interesting, and also really exciting how you were able to see the opportunity and kind of be, I guess, really the pioneers of the dry style of Riesling and the other reds that you guys were having. Did you how did you spread awareness about this new style for the area?
Just by taking it out and getting people to try it, just calling people. I would call high-end restaurants in New York and talk to the wine directors. Some of them wouldn't even believe me that they thought I was making up this fictional place called the Finger Lakes. Never heard of it. they would be like, what is this in Westchester? You mean? I'm like, no, it's out toward Buffalo. It's funny. Yeah, it wasn't on people's radar that long, 20 some years ago. So it's been fun to help, raise awareness of the region.
Yeah, more often than not, we will be one of the first Finger Lakes wineries that they get to try the wines from. So there's both the opportunity and the excitement of introducing a new wine region to many people. And that's a rare opportunity. And it's something we really enjoy kind of introducing, not just the winery, but letting people know how our small wine region fits into the greater picture.
Yeah. Oh, that's exciting. And just one more question. You mentioned that you started off by buying some, grapes from local growers. Did you actually end up purchasing your own vineyards eventually?
Yes, at this point, we're about 80% estate grown. We farm almost 130 acres in 4 different locations. I have continued working with one independent grower, the Argetsinger family. Sam Argetsinger was a dear friend who farmed what I think of as a very special vineyard site on the east side of Seneca Lake. And it's a site that I'm very fond of, that I believe makes some of our finest wines. So we have continued working with the family. His son has since taken over the vineyard operation. So that's now the one and only outside vineyard we work with. But it's a vineyard we're thrilled and honored to work with that vineyard. But we are largely growing our own grapes now, as I said, about 80% or so.
Oh, lovely. That's awesome. And well, actually, the second Riesling we're going to have today will be that our Argetsinger vineyard. So we'll all get to try that, which is really awesome. All right. Well, speaking of the wines, let's dive into that first one. We have the Ravines Dry Riesling 2018 here. I'm curious, Morten and Lisa, where, what was the kind of the year, the weather that like for this year, and kind of the tasting notes of this wine, and how did that affect what was made?
So 18 was not an easy vintage in the Finger Lakes. It started off really nicely, but the second half of the season, starting in mid-August, we had a substantial amount of rainfall that carried through the season. So we ended up doing the most sorting coming out of the vineyard that we have ever done, discarding quite a few grapes. But I'm very happy with the end results. It was just very painful going through that process of sorting through the grapes. But in the end, the vintage has actually matured really nicely. We have made a commitment over the years to hold our wine back for several years before releasing it, which I find is really important, so that you have a wine that's more ready to enjoy, that sort of coming out of its shell by the time it goes through the distributors and to you guys, and of course onto the consumer. So I think it's really important to have a wine that has seen several years in the bottle before it's being consumed. And so the 18, as always in the Finger Lakes, we can count on a wonderful acidity, but we do have varying degrees of ripeness depending on the year. And then we work quite a bit with extended lees contact as a way of softening the wine. Riesling can have quite a bit of phenolics, which gives some nice structure to the wine, but it's important to find a way to balance it all, and the lees play an important part in that.
Yeah, and that's something you can probably feel a little bit on the palate, right? The lees and the. Okay. What kind of texture does that add?
So, I mean, basically we take, at the end of the fermentation, you have to think of the wine settling. So you have all the solids settling down at the bottom of the tank, and we eliminate the heavy clay-like lees, but keep it on the lighter, fluffier lees, which are loaded with protein. And this in turn kind of coats some of what would bring astringency to the wine and softens it. So it's this softness and roundness that it that it brings to the wine that otherwise would perhaps be a little sharper.
Awesome. All right. Well, we do have a question here in the chat. A question about how much residual sugar does this wine have? And I know this one says dry, so I'm assuming it's 0, but I'm curious to see what the winemakers know and what you guys say.
So dry is it's a very variable concept depending on who you're talking with and where you are. This wine here is between 4 and 5 grams per liter residual sugar, but more than just the number, you have to really look at it in terms of the ratio between the residual sugar and the acidity, so that you're clearly in a range here where it leaves absolutely no coating behind from sweetness. So it's very much a dry Riesling. There's no, unlike, that's one of the main differences between working in the south of France and here, is you don't have the appellations with all the rules that you have in France. So it leaves a little more leeway, which can be good or bad, but it just means that you don't have all of the restrictions you would find over there. But I guess the short answer is between 4 and 5 grams per liter, and it clearly comes across dry.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I guess in the Finger Lakes, in any cool climate region, the wines can get so acidic that you almost need a little bit of residual sugar just to balance it.
Yes, I mean, there are wonderful Riesling made with all levels of residual sugar going in. Unlike any other variety, it covers the full range. I think that's one of the beautiful things about the Riesling, is that you can reach an equilibrium, not just one, but many different equilibrium, depending on where the grapes are grown, the wine is made, and the overall structure of the wine. I mean, how many other varieties can you think of where you can have amazing wines coming out with 7 or 8% alcohol and sugar ranging from where we are up to triple digit grams per liter? It's a unique variety, offering so much great variety from one style to another.
Yeah.
Underappreciated great variety, I would add. But we're a little partial.
Yeah, I love it. We have some great questions coming in the chat. Before we dive into those, I am curious, what are your tasting notes on this wine? What to you really, makes your Riesling something really special, and what aromas do you get out of it?
So this is basically an assemblage, as the French would say, or a blend of Riesling components from our 2 largest sites. So Finger Lakes is mostly composed of acidic shalestone soils, but the northern part of the Finger Lakes, where we are standing right now in Geneva, you have a wide band of limestone soil stretching across south of Lake Ontario, heading over to Niagara Falls, and then through the Canadian wine region over there. So the composition in here is nearly 50-50 between the limestone and the shalestone component. And each one of these sites bring kind of different sets of aromas and profiles. I think of the limestone component bringing more citrus fruit, even though analytically the acidity is essentially the same. It comes across a little firmer in the limestone site, and it also brings more floral mineral notes. Whereas I think of the shalestone site bringing more apple pear type aromas and a little more softness and a slight smokiness that I associate with the shale.
Oh yeah, there is a little smokiness when you start to think about it.
That's a bit of a generalization, but that's kind of how I think of the 2 sites, what they bring to them.
I always feel that the shalestone site always brings more, apple, pear maybe, but root vegetable, fennel, and a little herbiness also, I find.
Yeah, that is very much a savory quality to the Riesling as well.
Which makes it a great food wine. Also, it's so easy to pair with so many different foods.
And since the beginning, I mean, this is our original Riesling that we've been making since the 2002 vintage. And since the very beginning, it has had both of these components, both the shale stone and the limestone component in it. I mean, some of the individual vineyard pieces have changed, but it's always been a balance of these two components.
Gotcha. All righty. So we have a few questions in the chat here. So the first question is, when does the harvest for Riesling grapes usually start in the Finger Lakes region? And has that changed at all with the effects of global warming?
So the timing of Riesling harvest would be the 2nd and the 3rd week of October, typically. Occasionally, it can start towards the 1st week, but think of the 2nd and the 3rd week of October as being the prime Riesling harvest season. And yes, there has been a little bit of shift. So we're in a region with a very pronounced continental climate. In fact, I cannot think of too many wine regions with a more continental climate than ours. So it results in very cold winters and quite warm summers, but it also results in a lot of variation from one year to the next. So every year it kind of forces us to reevaluate what do we have this year? What does this particular vintage have to offer in terms of what we try to extract and what we try to leave behind and the kind of balance we want to achieve. So those are some of the questions we ask ourselves every single year. It never gets boring.
No, and also I just might want to say that just like you guys get hit a lot with some of the hurricanes that are down that come, from during hurricane season, very often they come up to us too during harvest, like during, I think, wasn't it 2005 Katrina, when it just rained and rained and rained like for 5 days in a row. We got a lot of those rains that ended up coming from the south. And so I think like climate change for us is just more extremes, more problems rather than.
The weather's becoming more erratic, which is really, I mean, yes, there has been a slight shift in the growing season, but the more concerning thing for us is how erratic it becomes, and also the nature of the rainfalls, with much more rainfalling harder on a shorter time frame, as opposed to gentler rain being spread out over a season. So those are all things that create headaches for grape growers and for the winemakers.
Yeah, I could definitely see how that would cause, oh man. Wow, we're getting so many good questions in the chat here. Kind of as a follow-up to the erratic nature of the weather, is that also true for your family in Provence?
I have to say they have it a little easier in the south of France. I mean, it's definitely, viticulture comes a little easier there. You don't have the extremes of the climate. You don't have the need to hill up your vineyard in the fall and unhill it in the spring. Here, we even had to totally revisit the idea of how we grow grapes, working with multiple trunks in every single plant. Things are definitely easier in the south of France. I mean, I have memories as a teenager of walking around the vineyard pruning grapevines in a t-shirt in March. It's a little easier there. That's all there is to it.
Yeah, makes sense. I am, let's see, we have another question here in the chat. Says, what does hill up mean? Kind of a follow-up to what you were just saying.
So there are two parts to a grapevine. You have the scion, the top part, which is the variety, and very often these days you specify the clonal selection as well. And then you have the bottom part, which is the rootstock, because since this northeastern part of the United States is kind of the home of the phylloxera root louse that we spread across Europe and the rest of the world, So thanks to that, all of the vines now need to be grafted. And that graft union is the weak point of the vine if we have a cold winter. So every year we must cover the graft union with soil to protect it. So that worst case scenario, we can reform the vines from the ground level up. So that's what it. And then in the spring is that we time the unhilling very judiciously, so that we can use the unhilling to keep the weeds under control as well. So it's a lot of work and a lot of risk of mechanical injury, and quite tedious work hilling up and unhilling the vineyards this way. There are many regions around the world that have since moved past that, thinking it's no longer necessary, but we've learned a couple of times in the Finger Lakes that it's a good idea to hill up the vines.
Gotcha. Oh, so I've never heard of that. That's so interesting. Okay, well, I want to finish up with one more question here about this Riesling specifically, and then we will get to the other questions once we talk about the second wine. And so the last question here, particularly for the dry Riesling, is how low is the pH in your Riesling?
So pH in our Riesling basically vary from 3.0 to 3.2. And what that means is that it makes the winemaking life a lot easier for winemakers, because a wine is much more stable in terms of microbiology at those kind of pH levels, rather than the high pH levels you find typically in a warmer climate. So it allows us to work with low SO2 levels and keep great freshness in our wines. We invariably work well below the SO2 standards of the European Union, even though in the US you're allowed to work with 2 or 3 times more.
Gotcha. Wow. All righty. Well, let's go on over to our next wine. We're going to be doing the Ravines Dry Riesling 2017 from the Argetsinger Vineyard. So this is that vineyard that Morten mentioned a little bit earlier with the other family that grows grapes. So go ahead and pour yourself a little bit of that one. It's even a little taller bottle than the other one. Is there a reason why the bottles are a different kind of size?
I'm going to let Lisa answer that one. What bottle?
You're the one that picked that one.
Well, one of the reasons is to differentiate. I mean, they're clearly different wines. I think we started off with tall bottles with both of them, but we find that some of these Riesling bottles are difficult to stack.
The retailers are complaining about it.
So, so with the more distributed wine, the first Riesling you tried, it became more important to have a bottle that was easier to stack, and we were more reluctant to change it on the second one.
Gotcha. All right. So could you tell us a little bit about the Argetsinger Vineyard, maybe just kind of the soil makeup? And, you know, obviously we heard about the family that you work with for that one, but yeah, what designates or what makes this special, and how is it different from the first Riesling we had?
Sure. So the Argetsinger Vineyard is situated down on the southeast corner of Seneca Lake. Several hundred feet up above Seneca Lake. It's on the southeast corner of Seneca Lake, facing west. As far as Finger Lakes vineyards go, it's situated quite high and relatively steep. We're not talking Mosel steep here, but for the Finger Lakes, it's quite steep. And it's also one of the older Riesling vineyards, or vineyards period, in the Finger Lakes, planted in the beginning of the 1980s. So it's a mature vineyard. In the Finger Lakes, we don't get to have vineyards that are 60, 80, or 100 years old. We expect the lifespan of a Finger Lakes vineyard to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 45, perhaps 50 years. It gets back to the trunk injuries with the cold winters and the hilling up and the unhilling. It's also a very rocky site, low vigor, kind of poor soil, and it's a little sliver of limestone soil in an area that's predominantly shale stone. And I find that the limestone character really shows up in this wine. And we've worked with that vineyard since the very beginning. I mean, it literally goes back to the first year where I worked with these grapes while still working for Constantine Frank. It took exactly one season to see how this vineyard stands out from the rest of them. I mean, it's one of those wines that you can immediately recognize, and therefore I think should see a single vineyard bottling. Since then, we've seen all of these single vineyard bottlings multiply all over the region, but I think they have to stand the test that you can pick it out in a blind tasting, and I believe this wine does that.
Wow. So there was a question earlier, and just to clarify, there's no shale stone in the soil here. It's just the limestone layer.
This is very much it's a Howard gravel over limestone.
Okay.
Is the specific soil group.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the Riesling is a 4-acre block at the very top of the vineyard. So we're approaching 1,100 feet elevation here.
Okay. Yeah, it does have a slightly, just has a different aroma to it. I can't quite put my finger on it, but it is very distinct compared to the first one that we had. It is distinctly different.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
So in the early days, this Argetsinger Riesling would constitute the limestone component of the blend that we had the first wine. Since then, most or all of the Argetsinger Riesling goes into this single vineyard Riesling, and the limestone component has been taken over here at the White Springs farm where we are in Geneva. So we introduced this single vineyard Riesling back with the 2007 vintage. Back when you had hardly any single vineyard Rieslings in the area.
Awesome. All right. So there are a few questions here we definitely want to get to. One of them is, this is kind of just about the wine growers in general, but are you and other wine growers in the region concerned about the Bitcoin mining and the use of lake waters? Does that have an effect on the winemaking and the grape growing?
I don't think it has any effect right now on our grape growing or winemaking, but it's not good for the sustainability of the lake. They're sucking in a lot of fish, and actually when they have to suck in water and then use it to cool, and then they throw it back into the lake, and it changes the temperature. And so we have had problems with more algae blooms and things like that. And so there's a group trying to fight against them and trying to keep them in check, because they were just kind of going under the radar before. But
anything that threatens to change the ecosystem here is definitely a source of concern. Absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, wow. And then we had another question about how many people do you need to work in your vineyard? And I think specifically when you're doing the hilling up process, which sounds quite involved.
Yeah, it's not as involved. I mean, there's just really two guys who've been working on a tractor, but it takes a long time. It's really tedious. Well, who? Well, and 4 different vineyards.
We have 4 tractor operators who work for us, and they manage to fill up and unhill the 130 acres or so in a timely manner. It's actually quite a bit of race. The tricky part is after harvest, before it gets too wet out in the vineyard, so you can't go out there without sliding all over in between the vineyard rows. So the tricky part is getting hilled up. The unhilling you can do a little more at your leisure in the spring, but it is a race because we harvest so late.
You can get really cold really
yeah, I mean, we're already typically in the first or the second week of November by the time we start filling up, so there's not a lot of time to work with.
Yeah, but the guys on the tractor, they have to go up each side, side of the vine, and push up the dirt. And so that's all done with tractor work. But as far as all the other guys working in the vineyards, we use an H2A crew. So it's a government sponsored crew where we're able to bring in the same guys every year. We have a team of 30 guys, 30-ish, that we share with a few other wineries. And they're able to work at, different wineries, different times. And it's great because we're able to pay them a living wage and pay for housing and get the same guys every year. And we don't just, and they go on the off season, they go home to their families in Central America. It used to be that, the people were just tossed away at the end of the season, and then, they didn't have anywhere to go. So it works out for everyone this way.
They do an amazing job. I mean, they're both very hardworking, conscientious, and they have great vineyard techniques. So when they come back every year, they actually get to know our vineyard sites really well. They're without these workers, not only in the vineyards, but throughout agriculture in the United States, this country would be in a bad place.
Yeah.
Oh man. I just have there's lots of awesome questions coming in just about like the area and stuff, but I'm kind of curious, you mentioned filling up in November. Are you dealing with snow at that time? Like, do you have any snow yet? Does it get cold?
A little bit of snow, but we could have a lot more. And sometimes, like even especially in the spring, the guys come back and start doing the pruning. I mean, I remember one year there was like 2 feet of snow on the ground, and I'm like, God, these people just came from the rainforests of Central America. They had to come out here, so it must seem like hell in New York.
Well, they've been through it before, so they know what clothes
Yeah.
to bring. Yeah.
It's not easy.
No. But you're absolutely right. Sometimes we have to almost go through with like a snow plow to create a passage so they can actually go out and start pruning the vineyards. So it can be very tricky. There's absolutely nothing easy about growing grapes in our region, which is true in some other regions around the world, but nothing easy.
What was it that like attracted you to the area? Like, was it the challenge? Was it just how, different the land was?
Promise of these beautiful wines we can make. That we have everything here. We have the climate, we have the soils, the slope, everything that we need to make these terroir-driven wines. That it's not easy to make in other places. What other cool climate region do you have in the U.S.?
That's definitely would be my answer too. I mean, the fact that we're able to produce such an enticing and such a different style of wine from what you find elsewhere in the United States, more elegant, more balanced at a time when Americans are really starting to become very interested not only in wine but also food and wine pairings. I think it was the perfect time to introduce some cool climate wines.
And it's stunningly beautiful out here, even in the wintertime when it's so cold. It's just so beautiful, and it's laid back. There are a lot of Mennonites around the area, and it's very much country farming. And there's great farms and cheesemakers and restaurants. And so it's super fun to come visit, especially through the winter, because it's not crowded and people have time like to show you their cellars. And so it's a really fun time to come visit, especially when you can come by yourself and not with kids. We just became empty nesters last year, so we're like really loving this time not having to drag kids everywhere we go.
Oh my gosh, it sounds like the perfect place to like do a little getaway, like a little, whether it's in the winter, little like snowed in kind of wine tasting adventure, which sounds lovely. And then of course, I mean, I'm familiar with the climate and stuff there, and so it's going to be really nice and warm in the summer, so it'd be a great time to even visit then too, and could even go to the lakes and that kind of thing. So you're in a really awesome spot.
Right at the corner of our vineyards, there's a beautiful old manor house called White Springs Manor, with old stately rooms with canopy beds and fireplaces. And you can literally just walk through the vineyard down to our tasting room. And so it's really, in the wintertime, I think they have rooms for, a little over $100 a piece. And so it's really a nice trip to come down. White Springs Manor House.
Right.
Okay, White Springs Manor House. All right, everyone add that to your itinerary for your next trip. Like everyone's gonna be like, oh, I'm gonna stay there. You know, but Lisa told me I should, you know, stay here. All righty. Awesome. Oh, wow. So many great questions here. So a little bit more just kind of about your winemaking process. Or do you use a biodynamic process, or what are your, you know, thoughts on that as well?
So I would qualify our vineyard techniques as sustainable. I mean, as landowners and as stewards of the land, we obviously want to leave the land in at least as good a condition as we found it in, if not slightly improved. So we go to great length to ensure that, with no use of herbicides, no use of insecticides, carefully hilling up our vineyards, but also planting cover crops in between the rows to minimize the erosion. We're very much following the practices of the Finger Lakes region. So we're fortunate to have Cornell University in our backyard, and they years ago put together a program called Vine Balance, which went towards certification of a sustainable practice. Unfortunately, that timing was really bad. This was happening in the fall of 2007, right when we had an economic downturn, and Cornell had to cut back the budget, and that was one of the first programs to be chopped since it was just ready to be launched. So luckily, we're over the next couple of years, we're going to finally see certification for these kind of sustainable practice in the Finger Lakes. Many of us are already using these techniques at the current time, but it'll be nice to see certification to kind of validate the efforts we put into it.
Yeah, well, that's really special. You get to have, you know, Cornell so nearby. It means you can probably, you know, learn a lot more about what makes up the region and the soils, and that just kind of adds to your knowledge to make even, you know, like to make all your wines and really even improve if you wanted to. Or I mean, they're great now, but like if you wanted to really dive deep, you could do that, I guess.
It's
really
a great resource to have, and they're literally a mile up the road. And in the early days, I mean, Cornell would test new grape varieties to kind of determine which ones might be suitable to plant in the Finger Lakes and which ones are too risky to kind of shy away from. And there have been some great people over the years who have really introduced some great techniques and really thought hard about what makes sense in terms of grape growing and winemaking in our particular regions. Like I mentioned, from the very moment you plant vineyards here in the Finger Lakes, it works a little differently, working with multiple trunks, working with these hillside vineyard sites that you don't find very much out on the West Coast, and also dealing with working late into the fall season. I mean, it's not uncommon for us to pick grapes right around or even after Halloween. So it requires good vineyard techniques, that's for sure.
But you know, Cornell is not always right. Also, at one point they were complaining that we were encouraging people to grow Pinot Noir and that we shouldn't be doing that because it's not really right for the region. And, you know, you don't plant Pinot, you plant it because you want to, your heart, and you have to do it for your soul. And so we carried on with our Pinot program, and we're so happy we have, because it's really worthwhile growing Pinot in this region. You can make beautiful Pinot Noir.
So I did see a question earlier on about other varieties we work with, and yes, Riesling is definitely the leading variety. It's probably the one variety a group of Finger Lakes winemakers would agree on that is the backbone of what we do and one of the things we can do the best. Some of the other white varieties we find interesting and worthwhile in the Finger Lakes are Chardonnay, Gewürztraminer, a little bit of Sauvignon Blanc, but that one is kind of risky. And on the red side, as Lisa said, historically Pinot Noir was the original red variety. The other red grapes commonly grown in the area are Cabernet Franc, which is gaining a lot of momentum, as you see down there. I mean, in nearby Virginia, that's their leading red variety too. We have a little bit of Blaufränkisch, also known as Lemberger, Cabernet Sauvignon, and Merlot. So we make a Bordeaux blend. But there's also room for introducing and experimenting with new grape varieties. We recently did some plantings of Gamay Noir for red wine and Sauvignon on the white side that will be coming into production. And some of our colleagues in the region are trying out new grapes. So definitely not a case of closing the door on varieties. We're continuing to explore new ones.
Yeah, I think while we're still talking about Riesling, I think it would be important to introduce, we have a German winemaker here, Riesling winemaker over here. Can anyone come say hello to everyone?
Gladly.
And he can tell you who he is. He makes wine in Germany also.
Hi, my name is Lippold. Nice meeting you.
Yeah. And so it's a really important what the German winemakers are doing also. They have kind of welcomed all the other Riesling producers in the world into their little group. So we can all learn from each other, you know, what is the best way to make and to market Riesling as well. We're all in agreement that Riesling is underappreciated, for sure, all around the world.
And the goal is not to make it too popular. It is, and I hope it will remain the varietal of the connoisseurs.
That's right, yeah.
You know, I do
Only people with
not
taste and
want to
class.
see this Marlboro fad for Riesling.
Right.
It should keep its niche, appreciated by those who are really interested in fine wines, you know? And this is a smaller group. Nothing against the wine consumer in general, yeah, but to go to the discerning wine connoisseurs, that pairs very well with Riesling and also with Pinot Noir. So wonderful grape varieties.
And white asparagus.
I'm very happy to be friends with the Hallgrens, whom I met a few years ago, and what Morten just said reminded me to my own situation in the Mosel. You know, people are asking, what is the altitude? Your Riesling, you are growing your Riesling. And I say 100 to 200 meters, which is nothing. But the climate is formed by our position 50th latitude,
Right.
which is same as Winnipeg. We don't have the winter influence from the Arctic, of course not, because we are lucky to have the Gulf Stream coming up towards France and England, you know. But this is going to change, and maybe we have another ice time in Europe, and all the Gulf Stream influence is going to deviate and differs. So our position on the most in Europe, the most northern region where Vitis vinifera can ripen, is same difficult situation as here in the Finger Lakes and Niagara and Ontario. The situation is very fragile. It is risky, and every year, as Morten says, we have to fight with nature, and not only to fight, but to combine with nature and seek the best solution for every vintage. So this is becoming even more difficult with these erratic climate situation.
I want to know your name again. That I just saw on the chat.
My name is Enno Lippold. Enno Lippold. Dr. Lippold. Some people are starting to tease me with the Riesling Doctor is back. You know, the Riesling Doc is back in America. I have not been here since 2 years, and I'm so happy that the alien Europeans are allowed to come in to this country again. So.
Thank you so much. It's always such a pleasure to have him here. We're gonna have a big Riesling tasting tonight.
Cheers.
Ooh, that sounds fun. All right. Wow, that was amazing. And I hate to move away from Riesling, but we do definitely have to make sure we get to taste our last wine. So let's jump over to that one. That one's going to be the Cabernet Franc 2019. All right. I'm excited we get to try some of the other grape varieties that you all have. Just in terms of like other wines that you make, you mentioned a few other reds, of course. But there was a question earlier about blending. So do you ever blend any of your red or white wines? Just like, do you make blends, or is it mostly about single varietals for you?
Oh, we have quite a few blends. We have our sparkling wine is a blend of Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, as you often find. We have another blend, white blend called Field Notes, involving a local muscat variety with Riesling. And sometimes it also involves the Gewürztraminer. And on the red side, we have a blend called Cerise, a blend of Pinot Noir and Blaufränkisch. And then we have two red Bordeaux variety blends called Maximilian and Le Petit Caporal that involve Merlot, Cabernet Franc, Cabernet Sauvignon. So we do quite a bit of blending.
Nice. All right, well, let's dive into this Cabernet Franc. What can you guys tell us about maybe the vineyard here? Of course, is this coming from the same place or similar place as the dry Riesling, the first one? Is this different? And then some tasting notes.
Sure. So the grapes are, again, from our two major vineyard sites, which is the White Springs Vineyard, which is where we're standing here in Geneva. That's our main vineyard site with almost 60 acres. And the other portion comes over from 16 Falls Vineyard on the east side of Seneca Lake, 47-acre vineyard site. The Cornell University deserves a lot of credit for introducing the Cabernet Franc variety in the mid-90s. Back then, very few people in the United States, including the Finger Lakes, were familiar with the Cabernet Franc variety. If they had heard of it, there were some unfortunate, unfair associations with bell pepper, and it turns out that it's a fantastic fit for the Finger Lakes region. Number one, along with Riesling, it's the most winter hardy variety that we have. So we actually get to make wine every single year, which is a nice thing. It'll tolerate temperatures of down to -14, -15 Fahrenheit in the middle of the winter, which we very often do see. Also, with respect to our colleagues in Virginia, you don't have too many other wine regions where Cabernet Franc is an important variety. And here, in terms of acreage and production, it's kind of taken over from Pinot Noir, which used to be the leading red variety. And while I love working with Pinot Noir, I think that's a very healthy situation because Pinot Noir is not for everybody. You have to have very good sites and a true dedication to work with Pinot Noir. So I think it's actually a good thing that Cabernet Franc is becoming the leading regional variety as it's happening now. many of my winemaking colleagues choose to make mostly rosé wine out of Cabernet Franc. At Ravines, it's used entirely for red wine. It does require very good vineyard sites, some of our most prized vineyard sites, because it's the last variety to ripen. And also it takes good nerves because very often we don't harvest this Cabernet Franc until early November.
Wow.
But I do find it's a good fit for the area.
Can I, and of course you'll have to have really nice barrels. Actually, can you see the big casks behind us? I'm gonna
Yes.
try to, it's right. Ooh. So you can see our barrel room.
Very easy.
And these big casks around. And I also wanted to just turn it back to show you how big our barrel room is and how many barrels we have. You see there are hundreds of barrels that all take topping, cleaning. It's a big kind of deal to have all these barrels. It's a lot of maintenance work as well. But the big casks that we got a couple of years, is it 2017?
Yes.
Started?
So in the early days, we would age the Cabernet Franc in barrels like our other red varieties, but we brought in these casks from Austria specifically for Cabernet Franc because we wanted less obtrusive use of oak for the Cabernet Franc, making a softer, rounder style where the oak really doesn't play a part other than softening and working again as always on the texture of the wine, but not actually have the oak be one of the components tasting it. So we brought these casks in specifically for Cabernet Franc, as Lisa said, back in 17. It's something my family worked extensively with in Provence, where only a very, very small portion of the wines would see barrel aging. It's a nice, respectful way of working with some of the grape varieties.
You know, you said that you were in San Diego, and when we sell a lot of this in California, this style of Cab Franc that they don't make there, and we found that there's a big divide between Northern and Southern California. Southern California is more California-centric wines or the wine market, but in Northern California, they're drinking a lot of European wines also, and so when I take this out like to different places, restaurants and somms, I always get such a nice reception because it's very much like some of the European wines that they get that not only has really nice fruit character, but also the herbs, the savory notes, the spiciness and minerality that you really can only achieve in cooler climates. So in fact, this morning I served this with, we had an event upstairs for our wine club, and I made a pork loin that I made a rub for with all kinds of really yummy fresh herbs. I put in a coffee grinder like rosemary, fennel pollen, wild fennel pollen, and garlic and thyme. And anyway, so just rubbing it on this pork and then kind of playing off a lot of the notes, the different notes that are in the Cab Franc. It went really well. So if anybody wants that recipe, I'd be happy to share it. I have a lot of really nice recipes. My email is lisa@ravineswine.com. I'd be happy to send it to you.
Oh my gosh, Lisa, yes. If I was in the Finger Lakes, I would be there all the time for that. That sounds amazing. And it's also, you kind of answered a question early on that someone had about, where your wine's sold. One of our customers said you've had no problem finding your wine in the eastern part of Canada. And then, so I guess, the northeast of the US and Canada, but also I guess, parts of California too.
Yeah, we have
26 different states currently.
Yeah.
Mostly in the east. It extends throughout parts of the country all the way to California and a couple of overseas markets.
Gotcha. It's wonderful. Oh, there's so many people so excited about the recipe. So Lisa, I'll email you and I'll share, of course, I'll share your email with everyone, but I'll send a follow-up and then we'll get that recipe so you all can cook. Maybe that could be some people's New Year's Day pork kind of dinner. That'd be good. All right. Let's see. Do we have any other questions? Oh, there was another question about the vines. And so the question was, are you working exclusively with vinifera or also with hybrids?
That's a very good question, because we are in a wine region here where you have the native grapes known as Labrusca grapes, you have the European vinifera grapes, and then you have all of the crossings in these different grape varieties known as hybrid varieties. And in fact, one of the things they do up at Cornell University, they have what's called a grape breeding program where they come up with some of their own crossings, particularly well suited to the Finger Lakes. So at Ravines, we don't have any native grapes. I'm afraid I don't really know personally how to make wine from Concord and Catawba and Niagara that meet my expectations and my definition of wine. We do work on a very small scale with a couple of different hybrid varieties. Things like Cayuga and Vignoles that have been around the Finger Lakes, really time tested here early on. We also make a pretty interesting dessert wine from Vignoles, a late harvest Vignoles, which is particularly sensitive to botrytis. So you get some of that nice noble rot character in there. And on the red side, we work with one of the more recent hybrids called Noire, which we blend back with Cabernet Franc, making an early drinking unoaked red wine. And then we have a little bit of Alvin Muscat as well. So we work a little bit on a small scale with hybrids, but it's a small part of what we do.
Yeah, but it's fun. 3 of those varietals Cornell developed in their experimental vineyards that are just right up the road. So it's really part of the region. We're happy to do that. It's fun.
Wow. Oh, so much experimenting. That sounds so great. And then just, you mentioned unoaked and stuff just a minute ago, and you showed us all those barrels. And so just a question about the Rieslings that we had, and of course the Cabernet Franc, which of those were aged in oak or stainless steel tonight?
So the Rieslings are all stainless steel aged, and the Cabernet Franc is aged entirely in the casks between us. We use the barrels for Chardonnay and for the other red varieties, the Cabernet blend, Maximilian, the other Cabernet blend, the Petit Caporal, and also for our Cerise blend of Pinot Noir and Blauenfränkisch, and of course Pinot Noir itself. You have to be very careful working with barrels in the Finger Lakes. It's very easy to overwhelm the wines here with oak. So we typically work with a 5-year rotation. It's always important, at least that's part of what was pounded into my head going to winemaking school in France, is that the oak is there in a supporting role, not in a competing role. So it kind of has to stay in the back. And Finger Lakes wines are amazingly vibrant and aromatic, but they're lighter wines. So we have to be careful not to overwhelm the wines with oak.
Yeah, that makes sense. And we've been talking a lot about, still wines, but I know you also do sparkling, correct? And with that, do you do any pet nats? That's a question here in the chat.
You want to answer or should I answer?
Morten is not a pet nat person. Classic.
Everything we do is traditionally bottle fermented. Just personal preference. Yes, I mean, we've been making sparkling wine on and off since 2006, starting on a very small scale with Chardonnay and Pinot Noir based, but also along the way introducing Riesling as well. Sparkling Riesling is something we're very fond of, and over the last 3 years we really ramped up our sparkling wine production, we see great potential in the Finger Lakes for sparkling wine. And as a winemaker, we always love the idea of having options of either harvesting a little earlier for sparkling, harvesting a little later for still wine in a region such as ours, and with a highly variable climate and everything else Mother Nature throws at us, it's always good to have options.
Yeah, he leaves our sparkling 7 years on tirage, and it's really beautiful and delicate and very expressive of the vineyard site, the limestone vineyard site. So it's just, I think it's a really one of the best wines we do. Like, it's very special. And yeah, you have to come try it. We don't make very much of it, but we have increased our production. But increasing our production means that we'll have more 7 years down the road.
Well, we're 3 years into it. So one of these days you'll start to see a little bit more headed your way.
Ooh, we'll keep an eye out for it. But I guess if you really want to try, you got to go to the Finger Lakes.
Yeah, we will have sparkling Riesling out sooner, though. That will be out in the next 2 years.
Yes, and all through the winter time, we're going to have down here a little winter wine lounge where we have raclette and breads and Riesling, and we just pickled a bunch of fennel to have with it also. And so we have things ready to keep ourselves occupied.
Planning for a long winter.
Yes, planning for the long winter.
Oh, wow. Awesome. Well, we have one more question in the chat here, and then I'd love to just, let anyone jump in and just share maybe their thoughts about the wine before we close out. I know we're going a little bit over, but this has been such a good conversation with both of you, Lisa and Morten, and Dr. Lippold as well. So the last question is, which side of the Finger Lakes in the Finger Lakes region is better for vineyards, the east or west? Is there a difference?
So that's a really good question, because all of our lakes are oriented north-south. I mean, we would all have loved a southern exposure, but that's just not in the cards for us. So our vineyards either face east or west. And I would say in the early days where we didn't have quite everything that we have now in terms of protecting our vineyards against diseases and everything, it was important to be in a place where you had the early morning sun, so on the west side of the lake. Nowadays, you can argue that it might be advantageous to be on the east side of the lake, so you get the late afternoon sun, which normally should result in slightly riper grapes. But to answer your question, our vineyards are pretty much evenly balanced between east and the west side of the lakes. What it really comes down to is the mesoclimate, finding the particular site that works well based on the slope and the soil composition, the drainage. We're still a young wine region. I mean, most of our vineyard sites here are planted for the first, sometimes the second site. We're going to need much more time, many, many more decades to really say with any kind of certainty that we may have started to get it right in terms of what to plant where. So it'll take time.
Awesome. Alrighty. Well, thank you so much, Lisa and Morten, for just, giving your time to chat with us about your wines. It has been such a joy. Yes, cheers. I've truly enjoyed chatting with you, and I think everyone else has too. Is there anyone here in the audience that would love to unmute and just, maybe share your thoughts about your favorite wine, or if you have any last questions?
Well, we're open all winter long, and we have reservations that can be made on Cellar Pass, or if you're looking for a more like kind of in-depth tasting, you can always just email us, and we're out here all winter long.
Ravines Wine.
Oh yeah, ravineswine.com.
Well, thank you everyone for being here. I'm just loving so much that everyone is just so happy and enjoying all the wines today and our chat. And so with that, I just want to say a big thank you to Lisa and Morten Hallgren for leading us through these lovely wines and sharing the Finger Lakes region with us. It means so much. Also, thank you to Dr. Lippold for coming in for a quick cameo and, sharing his love of Riesling with all of you. And yeah, happy holidays to all of you. And we're looking forward to seeing you again. And thank you all for being here.